Welcome to Margin Notes from the Central Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky. We're glad you joined us for this latest video, which is the third on the book of Deuteronomy. We did a video introducing the book with background material, and then 2 weeks ago we released a video discussing notes for Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 4. As you can see on the screens, we're going to cover in this video Deuteronomy chapters 5 through 13, which is part of that huge speech that covers the majority, in fact, the big majority of this book, this great book of the Old Testament, the fifth book of the Bible. If you're new to Margin Notes, we have covered several books already: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and even jumped over and did Philemon in a video, and we're now covering the book of Deuteronomy. We always encourage you to write these notes down in a notebook or on your computer somewhere and study them and see if they're worthy of your own Bible study, your own margin, or wherever you keep your notes. And I say from time to time, the text of the Bible is inspired. My notes aren't, and so you may find some mistakes or things that could be worded better, and that's fine. These are just things that I find helpful to some degree, and maybe you will as well as you study these books. So we'll jump in. As you can see, this is a little bit longer section of Scripture, but we always try to keep these videos to about 20 minutes or so, and we'll do our best to do that even with this one, even though we're covering quite a bit of ground. Deuteronomy 5, by the way, contains the re-giving of the Ten Commandments, so a huge part of this book, and several of the notes will come from that chapter. The first note comes from Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 3. Let's read verses 1 through 3 to remind us of what's going on here. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Now, the reason I have dots in there is because the parts that I have underlined or squared in is fairly lengthy. But with us, who are all of us here alive today, all of that's underlined, that sort of thing. But think about what Moses is saying for a second. This generation he's speaking to, the children had been at Mount Sinai when the Ten Commandments were given, but a huge number of them hadn't been. But he says that God gave the covenant to this generation. Well, he had given it to the previous generation. Moses is trying to make a point of application. And the note is that the law was not just for that first generation, that one generation. The law was to continue. It was as if God had given the commandment to that first generation at Sinai back in Exodus 19 and 20. It was as if God gave that law to this generation, and it would be as if God gave it to the next generation all along the way. It was as if they had been right there at Sinai, hearing the same law, because the law would not change. God's law remained the same until Christ took it out of the way and nailed it to the cross. So just a powerful point of application there about our understanding of the Word of God, that it is the same. It doesn't change. Just because generations come and go, God's Word stands forever. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 8 is a retelling of the second commandment, the not having any graven image. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or is on the earth beneath, or is in the water under the earth. What I have there, and if you watched the last video, you may remember I had a similar note back in chapter, 3, I believe, that this command prohibits all idolatry, obviously, but that includes trying to represent God himself through an image. Anything that is in heaven above. Now, that could mean the sky, the heavens like birds and those sorts of things. It could also mean heaven above. Someone could be guilty of trying to make a carved or graven image of God himself. And so this prohibits any kind of idolatry, any kind of carved or graven image of obviously things like animals or people or those sorts of things, but also trying to make some sort of image of God himself would be prohibited by this command. God did not want to be worshipped through things like idols and those sorts of things. And he certainly didn't want anything else worshipped in that way. But even he did not want to be worshipped through idolatry and images and all of that. And so he prohibits all of it with this command. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15. This is in the follow-up of the commandment of the Sabbath day. Verse 12 is observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. And then it talks about what the Sabbath day was. 6 days, do your work and all of that. But verse 15, you shall remember this is following up that command. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, it's interesting that in Exodus chapter 20, when this same command is given, the reason for the command is creation. For in 6 days the Lord God made the heavens, the earth, all that in them is, and that then the sanctified, set apart the Sabbath day, keep it holy. This is not changing the command, but it's connecting that same command now back to God's deliverance. You remember the Sabbath because of when God gave it to you. He brought you out of the land of Egypt. He brought you out of bondage. So in Exodus 20, the reason behind the command, the reason, remember, was creation. Now the reason given is God's deliverance, the Exodus itself. Again, it didn't change the command at all. It just connected it in their thinking to something else. And really connected all of those things together. But it's just interesting that the reason behind the command, or the reason to remember the command, changes here in Deuteronomy chapter 5 from what it was in Exodus chapter 20. Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4, this great section about what parents were to teach their children, what the older generation was to teach the younger generation. The beginning of it was, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, the Shema. Sometimes, as I have there on the screen, sometimes that command is regarded as a positive way of restating the first 2 of the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make any graven image. Some suggest that this is sort of a positive spin. So that you do not, now it's a positive way. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you can continue down. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. All of that going through there follows up on the same thing. But it's just a positive way of stating that. It's not just don't worship other gods, it's worship God. That He is the only one anyway, so make sure you worship Him. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 9. I had never thought about this, frankly, and so I mentioned before that I share with you notes I've had, but I also, in preparing for these videos, I'm studying these books myself again, and for my own study, but then also to have things for these videos, some more things for these videos. And I had never thought about this one until I was restudying this passage for myself and then thinking about these videos later. The thing about teaching your children when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, verse 9 says, You shall write them, the laws of God, on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The phrase your gates is what's interesting. You have the notation there. That could be, of course, the gates in or around a house. That's very possible because he just said doorposts of your house and on your gates. But it is also possible that it could be the city gates, which would show an outward expression of God's law in society. You write them on the doorpost of your house, and then further out from that, you write them on the city gates. Now, it could be either one. I'm not making an argument for either one, but it's just interesting to think about that he could mean the house in the first part of that, write them on the doorpost of your house, and then simply the community, the city, with the phrase your gates. Just an interesting way of looking at that command that I never had thought about until I was studying this again. But it makes perfect sense that either one could be the case, or it could be both that God means here. Gates in and around a house and gates around a city or community. Since they were getting right near the promised land and would have cities finally, maybe that's what was meant here by this expression. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 2. We're going to start reading in verse 1. Moses said, When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many of the nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, you must devote them, here's the phrase, to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. The phrase complete destruction bothers a lot of people, and it's tough to read sometimes. But later on in this very same chapter, you have something that's very important to notice. The note that I have is that verse 5 shows that this was not annihilation, because verse 5 says, But thus you shall deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their Asherim and burn their carved images with fire. Wait a minute. How does that mean it's not annihilation? Because the stuff was still there. But thus you shall deal with them. The people are still there. So the idea here is of an overwhelming victory. In fact, if you have an English Standard Version, beside that phrase, complete destruction in verse 2, you have a footnote that says something like, set apart as an offering for the Lord. So it could mean not annihilation. So it means you take the things that you need to take. You destroy the things that need to be destroyed. You win an overwhelming victory. You will win an overwhelming victory is probably the meaning of what Moses has in mind behind that phrase. Deuteronomy 7 verses 9 and 10. Both those verses use the word those. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him. By destroying them, he will not be slack with the one who hates him. He will repay him to his face. What I have marked is that the word those in the two verses, one in verse 9, one in verse 10, well, one is plural, one is singular. The verse 9, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those, plural, who love him, keep his commandments, to 1,000 generations, to the people. Verse 10, he repays to the face those, singular, individuals who hate him by destroying them. The expectation is faithfulness all throughout, both collectively, verse 9, and individually, verse 10. That may be a small distinction, but it's just interesting to read those couple of verses, knowing that little distinction in the terminology there. That verse 9 is plural, the word those. Verse 10 is singular, and it speaks to the covenant nature of this, that God chose the nation of Israel and would keep his faithfulness to the nation of Israel throughout all these generations. But the ones who were unfaithful were going to be destroyed because of their own choice of what they had done, to God in spite of what he had given to them. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 10. I love this verse as he's talking about what they're going to find when they come in the promised land. He says, "And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you." The note that I have is simply that God's gifts are to be enjoyed. And his people are joyful because they understand where their provisions come from. God gave the people the promised land, yes, as a testimony to him, but also to enjoy and eat the fruit of the land. Do these things. Enjoy this land. And where we find the greatest joy is in knowing where our blessings come from. They come not from us, they come from God. Now, God may use us to help bring those blessings about, but they come ultimately from him. You may want to mark in your Bible also just a cross-reference there to James 1:17, that every good and every perfect gift comes from above, coming down from the Father of lights. Every good thing we have comes from him. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 6, you have the word stubborn. "Know therefore the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people." And you're going to see that word a whole bunch of times in the Old Testament because, well, it's true, people are stubborn. But that word literally means hard of neck. And I have that written out to the side because you can just see it. It's a powerfully, picturesque word. The people are just, hardening not just their heart, they're hardening their neck. They're just that stubborn. And the idea seems to have come from agriculture. That you have an ox or something that you're trying to turn one way, but it hardens up its neck, and you can't get it to turn. You have to fight it to turn a certain direction or to do a certain task. And that's the word then that is chosen here to describe the people of God, that they're hard of neck, they're hard to control because they just want to go their own direction. They fight against what God says constantly. They murmur and complain and all these things. And so that's the word picture behind that word that we know. We know the word stubborn, but that's the word picture behind that word found in Deuteronomy 9:6 and a bunch of other places in the Old Testament especially. Deuteronomy 9 and verse 28. Again, if you have dots in there, it's simply because what I have underlined is fairly lengthy. Verses 27 and 28 say, "Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not regard the stubbornness," there's that word, "of this people, or their wickedness or their sin, lest the land from which you brought us say, Because the Lord was not able to bring them into the land that he promised them, and because he hated them, he has brought them out to put them to death in the wilderness. So that whole phrase, has brought them out to put them to death in the wilderness, is what I have marked. And the note that I have beside that is that the enemies of God could think that God's powers were limited if he saved Israel only to have them perish soon afterward. Now, he was able to save them from Egypt, and that's amazing. But he couldn't save them from a wilderness. He couldn't save them from, from dying out there. He couldn't save them from, being attacked by animals or from another nomadic army or something. And so God is saying that one of the reasons that this covenant is there and these people are still there is to show his power, that he could save them not just from Egypt. That was child's play. And so is keeping them alive for all these years in the wilderness. That's child's play to God. And so just a note there as to why you have that phrase at the end of verse 28 in that chapter. Deuteronomy 10:15, you have the note on the screen. Here's what the verse says. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are this day. It's an Old Testament reminder of we love him because he first loved us. What did Israel do to be chosen by God? Absolutely nothing. In fact, more than once, God would tell them, or Moses would tell them for God, that you were a small nation, you're the smallest nation, you're a weak nation, all these things, but yet I loved you, I chose you. And he's reiterating that here in this passage, and it's just a reminder of the same thing in the New Testament. What did we do to deserve the love of God? Nothing. We love him because he first loved us. He chose us, not in some Calvinistic way, but he chose the faithful before the foundation of the world. We respond to that in faith and in love, but it's because we've seen his love that we have something to which to respond. Deuteronomy 10:17, speaking of the kind of people God would have them to be, but here he's speaking really about God himself. This same phrase is found later about judges, but here's about God. The Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. You can't bribe God, right? That phrase literally means he does not lift up faces. God doesn't show partiality. He doesn't look at us in the face and go, that one looks better than the other one. No, you can't bribe him. You can't do anything to trick God, to get God on your side because you've done something amazing. God's not going to be mocked. God doesn't show partiality, and that's what's found in that phrase. Deuteronomy 11 and verse 6. A reminder looking back on Numbers chapter 16, what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the sons of Reuben, how the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them in the midst of all Israel. You may want to cross-reference there to number 16. That's the account it's talking about. But it's a reminder here that to oppose a God-chosen leader is to oppose God. For example, in the New Testament, congregations are overseen by elders. If those elders are men who fulfill the qualifications of elders, and I just flat out oppose them, not on scriptural grounds, but I just don't like what they say, so I just oppose them. I'm opposing God. Parents are put in a place of leading children by God. And so if children are disobedient to parents, that's why that command is so strong in the Old Testament, because to be rebellious against parents is to be, in a way, by extension, rebellious against God. And so that's found in that passage in Deuteronomy 11 and verse 6. Deuteronomy 11 and verse 14, talking about the blessings that God would give if the people would be obedient to, and verse 13 talks about that. One of them is, he will give the rain in your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain. That should say later instead of late on the screen, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. What's the early rain and the late rain? What's different than it is in our part of the world? Our part of the world, early rain might be, something like March, April, May, right in there. Late rain, maybe something like September, October. It's exactly the opposite in that part of the world. Early rain is in October, November. You might just want to say fall, mid-fall. It breaks up the summer drought. It provides cultivation, those sorts of things. The late rain is in what we would have as March, April, springtime, Easter time, that sort of thing, which helps fruit trees and other plants finish production. Why is it that things like the Passover are in the spring? That's why. Because that's when they're bringing things in. That's when crops are beginning really come into their own and all those sorts of things. It's not like it is here. You harvest most things in August, September, October, in that part of the country, or part of the world, excuse me. The late rains and then the harvest is more like March, April, May, and so that's early and late rain. And God says, "You're faithful." That will be something you do not have to worry about. That you will gather your stuff in, because the early rain, the one that breaks up the ground, and then the late rain, the one that helps crops finish producing and all that sort of thing, all that will continue on because of me. This may seem like a very strange one, because you just have the word "you" and you have a whole chapter. The reason I have this for you, this little word "you" in Deuteronomy 12, is because part of the way through the chapter, again, the singular and plural changes. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, every time you see the word "you" or things like "your," those sorts of things, it is plural. It is national. But then beginning in verse 13, every time you see the word "you," "your," "yours," it is singular. It takes the national view and makes it personal, makes it individual. And so it's one of those things that it's a subtle change, and it may not make a whole lot of difference to us as we read through, but it does make the chapter sort of come alive. That this first, not half, first chunk of the chapter is just national, plural, groups of people, but then it becomes very personal, very singular, very individual in the latter, 60% or so of the chapter, where it becomes a singular thing. I don't know how you want to mark that. I just simply have above verse 1, I've written out verses 1 through 12, "you" is plural, and then above verse 13, I've written verses 13 through 28, "you" is singular. You may want to mark all of them or something, I don't know, but however you want to mark that to be helpful to you to note that change might be a help to your reading. Deuteronomy 12 and verse 8, in the middle of all those "yous," "you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes." The idea is that liberty was allowed, but it would be reined in so as not to become licensed. In other words, the Old Testament, yeah, there were 600 and something laws, but there were certain things that still liberty. You could still do certain things, but you don't just do whatever you want to do. You don't get away with just stepping away from the law of God. You must be within the will of God. And that phrase, "everyone doing what's right in his own eyes," of course, comes back later in the Old Testament, the book of Judges, twice, as a sign that everything had become chaotic and wrong and evil. But here it's just a reminder that there is liberty allowed, but not licensed. In other words, not licensed to go against the law, the commandments of God. Deuteronomy chapter 13 and verse 5. This is the text, a text that deals with one who would come and claim to be a prophet. Beginning of verse 4. "You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and hold fast to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk, so you shall purge the evil from your midst." You've got these people coming in, claiming to be prophets of God. They're not. What's the punishment? You put them to death. It's interesting that according to the biblical record, that was rarely done, if ever done, which may suggest either that the people just didn't follow through with it, or that the fact that there was death penalty attached to it lessened the chances of somebody actually breaking that law. Both of those are possible. But you look through the Old Testament, this just does not happen very often, which may mean that you attach the death penalty to something, and people think twice about actually going through with it, being so presumptuous as to claiming to speak for God when they know they're not, and they're just trying to trick God's people or get their own way, and if they get caught, they're going to be put to death. So why would you ever do that? And so, just something to note there about the continuing of the biblical record, that this actual punishment was rarely done. Deuteronomy 13:13 talks about worthless fellows. "Certain worthless fellows have gone out among you, drawn away the inhabitants of the city, saying, 'Let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known.'" This note's interesting to me. It may not be to you, but I want to share it with you anyway. That the word "worthless fellows" there is actually a form of the word Belial that you read in the New Testament in Paul's writing to the Corinthians. The word simply means without worth. Belial does. But really, the note that means more to me is that second one, the ones of parentheses. The Revised Standard Version has base fellows. And I kind of like that a little more than worthless. These are just people without morals. They're base people. And so, again, just a note there about a phrase that we know what it means, worthless fellows, but kind of a connection there to something we read about in the New Testament. You go, what in the world does that mean? Belial. Here's a form of it. But then also to another translation that gives us maybe not a better translation, but one that just to me I can just sink my teeth into a little better. Base fellows. So we hope all these notes have encouraged you. We've gone through chapters 5 through 13 of Deuteronomy. We look forward to recording another video and releasing our video in a couple of weeks on the next few chapters of Deuteronomy. We're working our way through that great book. I'm being encouraged by the study of it. Well, frankly, as I'm doing these videos, I have studied it. I usually finish studying and then do the recording, but I'm still being encouraged by going back to the notes to make the videos, and hope they're encouraging to you as well as we release all of these to you. Please take a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel or the Facebook page. We release these videos on both. We'd love to have you subscribe to both, release some different things on each of those things from time to time, and maybe each of those videos or other things we release will encourage you. And as always, we hope Margin Notes help you to read the Bible, study the Bible, and live the Bible. Thanks for watching.